Thank you so much, Ambassador Kay, for this conversation. You have been traveling back and forth to Afghanistan over the last 50 years. You have seen ups and downs, you have seen revolutions perhaps, you have seen regime change. But now the Taliban, are we entering a black hole?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Tahir, for having me on your show. Are we entering a black hole? I'm not quite sure what that means. I think we are in one of those periods of Afghan history where there is likely to be, again, another change. I've seen, as many Afghans have seen, the Taliban already arrive once in 1996, and then to mess up, essentially, and not to gain acceptance from the Afghan people. In 96 to 2001, they didn't control the whole country. They were far from accepted by many Afghan communities and eventually not by the international community. And I'm afraid I see that sort of history potentially repeating itself again now.
But why do you think that part of the world never sees a permanent stability? I mean, when you look at the history, we see a lot of ups and downs. By entering a black hole, I mean that is Afghanistan. You know, it has come to a point to square one again. So people are quite concerned, and experts, you know, they warn about consequences. So why is it really experiencing the same scenario again and again?
Gosh, that's a big question, and it would require somebody more academic and historically informed than me to answer it properly. But obviously, Afghanistan has always suffered from its geographic location and the interference and interests of neighboring countries and the wider world in general. And so it has been the scene for, if you like, proxy competition between other powers in the past, and that remains the case, I'm sure, today as well. I mean, disappearing into a black hole is unfortunately, you know, not actually completely accurate. Yes, it's a black hole in terms very often of the living conditions for Afghans who suffer immense poverty and now immense deprivation of human rights and basic civil and political rights. That's a sort of black hole. For the wider world, it has been to some extent a black hole in the sense of it has been a center recently for international terrorism, and that remains a concern now. But also the center of a huge narcotics industry, which has flooded the world in the past with very dangerous drugs. So yeah, it's not a happy picture. What obviously needs to be done now is, first of all, to help the Afghan people. I mean, they are suffering, and their humanitarian and economic plight is severe. But I suspect that Afghans themselves also need to do the hard work to prepare for an Afghanistan that is after the Taliban.
Well, we will get to the drugs and migration and all that, Ambassador, but you were in Afghanistan in different capacities, and you know the people, you know the country very well. It will be really interesting to hear from you that the reasons behind the collapse of the republic.
Yeah, again, a complicated question. I mean, one of the fundamental issues is that the support for the republic from its international partners, principally the United States, dissipated, evaporated. Now, some of that is to do with, I think, US domestic politics, if you like, that there is very little support or votes for a continuing military presence and expenditure in Afghanistan. So that went. Why did it go? Well, it's a factor of, I guess, a couple of things. First, of course, just fatigue over time. This was, from the US point of view, a long engagement of more than 20 years. And secondly, I think they got increasingly disillusioned by the governance within Afghanistan, and that is governance that accepted, tolerated a high degree of corruption, but also, most importantly, a governance that could not find sufficient unity amongst Afghan stakeholders from different communities, different ethnic groups, different political persuasions. It was that disintegration internally of Afghan political unity that I think sealed the fate of the Republic.
Ambassador, once Afghanistan was on the spotlight of the international news, but these days we hardly see anything coming out of Afghanistan. Is the country really marginalized? Is the war really turning are they really ignoring, what's happening in that country in terms of, repressive policies against women, insecurity, unfortunately, and also media, because there is no independent media to report. So is it really diverted to Ukraine? Because a lot of, people who reach out to us, they ask that there is, hardly anything really. So who is really holding the folder of Afghanistan these days at the international stage?
Yes, I think you're right that there is definitely a sense in which the high-level political attention that was very briefly given to Afghanistan around the summer of 2021 has definitely moved on, and not just high-level political attention, media attention as well, and whether that is in some senses a deliberate wish to forget because it was a disastrous and to some extent shameful episode in August 2021, and so I think politicians would prefer to forget about it and focus attention elsewhere. Some of it is a result, yes, of the Ukraine war being closer to home for European and arguably North American audiences and other competing crises in the world. So that doesn't mean nothing is happening, as you well know. I mean, there are a dedicated group of envoys and countries convened also by the United Nations that sustains a high level of effort and interest in the country, humanitarian, obviously, but also political. But it's nothing probably as sufficient as the problem requires.
And Ambassador, in a very recent interview, you talked about the Taliban not really surviving in power in this shape. Could you please elaborate? Because I personally was very interested to know more about, your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't think it requires, as many people on Twitter have pointed out, doesn't require a foreign former diplomat to point these things out. That, I mean, the Taliban do not, as far as one can see, represent or even have the support of the vast diversity of Afghanistan. So it seems to be not able to reach an inclusive government that represents genuinely the interests and views of all Afghan communities. Plus the fact that it is not in any way seeming to adapt its style of government and its substance of government as well, its respect for civil, political and human rights. It's not able to adapt those to the 21st century. Afghanistan, and the people of Afghanistan have changed a lot, I believe, over the last 20 years. But the Taliban haven't, and they will, I think, fall victim to that historical time lag. They are on the wrong side of history, literally, in this.
But when it comes to world's engagement, you pointed out to the special representatives of some countries that they're really engaging the Taliban in order to deliver aid and also, assess the situation there. but that is not really working out. What's the way out? Because, you know, as we can see, by every passing day, we see more repressive policies against women. We see more restrictions on citizens in Afghanistan. For example, the recent ones, women not allowed to go to parks, to public baths. And even yesterday, there was a news coming out that women were, restaurant owners were asked not to allow women to have food. So is the world really watching or doing something? What is the leverage that they have on the Taliban?
Yes, I think that's a very good question. I think, first of all, it has to be said that it is impressive and noteworthy that this time round, as opposed to in 1996, there is no government, no country in the world that recognizes the Taliban officially. And I think that speaks volumes to the shared perception that, you know, this is a regime that may have de facto authority over the country, but is by no means fulfilling the criteria for being recognized as a legitimate government. And that remains the case. And I think it, you know, I would worry me if there is a move towards normalizing in any sense relations with the Taliban, unless and until the Taliban normalize their treatment, particularly of women, but their treatment in general of Afghans. You know, unless there is a fulfillment of the commitments that they made, I believe, across the negotiating table in Doha, to having a genuine intra-Afghan negotiation leading to a genuinely inclusive, representative and accountable government that fully respects human rights. And we're a long, long way from that, obviously. So I think the international community should do as it is at the moment, continue to push for that, to argue for it, to lobby for that. And I think it is right that many in the international community also are looking at the question of more tougher sanctions and accountability for the Afghan treatment, particularly of women. And there is an active discussion and debate now, I think, internationally as to whether what the Taliban are doing amounts to a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And let us see. It requires international lawyers to look at that. And but my sense is that that is the direction of travel now, because the widespread, systematic repression and persecution of one section of society, which is 50% of the Afghan population, surely, in the court at least of public opinion, amounts to a crime against humanity.
But at the same time, Ambassador, it should be very concerning for the world as well, especially Europe, the United States, the UK, and many other countries in terms of extremism. Because when you look at the curriculum that the Taliban are changing, a lot of people ask that if this really continues like this, in 10 years' time, we will have a generation of really extremists and fundamentalists, even if the schools really open, because they are going to change, you know, the curriculum. When it comes to drug trafficking, that is another issue. Migration is another issue. I'm sure you receive a lot of messages and calls from your old Afghan friends. We do as well, that they keep on asking that they need to find a way out. So with this situation, is it really not concerning for these, you know, countries, the partners of Afghanistan, that migration, I'm sure, you know, a lot of countries, including the United Kingdom, is facing, you know, this challenge, and in Europe as well. So don't you think that they're really concerned about these issues and what should be done?
Yeah. You're absolutely right in your listing of the issues of concern. On migration, I think it is important that those countries, particularly in the West, who have announced schemes to help Afghans resettle following legal and legitimate routes to resettlement, that they honour those commitments, and it is, quite shocking and disturbing to see what a big gap there is between the public commitments and promises and the actual numbers of Afghans who have been resettled under these schemes. That's deeply concerning, and unless and until there are proper, safe and legal routes honoured and established by these countries, there will be an increase in illegal migration and the tragedies that follow from that, as we see people drowning in the Mediterranean, people drowning in the channel between France and England. Shocking. So migration, yes. Terrorism, absolutely. I mean, I'm not in government or in service anymore, but I would be enormously surprised if the relevant agencies and services are not taking a very, very close interest in what is happening in Afghanistan and the very real risk that under the Taliban rule, there will be more space and more opportunity for international terrorists to operate. I mean, we have seen that the Taliban have not managed to do anything significant to counter ISIS, for example, ISKP. And also, we all know the Taliban's enduring close links with Al-Qaeda. So that, will definitely command attention, and rightly so. I think, otherwise, the international efforts definitely need to be focused on supporting Afghans to prepare, as I say, for a future that is post-Taliban, by supporting the efforts of many of the Afghan opposition groups in the diaspora abroad to cohere around an agreed political agenda. Take this opportunity of being now in exile, and it may be, for it's been 2 years, it's still quite early days, it may be even, unfortunately, several more years before the wheel turns. Use that time to thrash out and work out some basic agreements on some of the political tenets and outlines of a future Afghanistan. Big questions for Afghans to look at and resolve. What will be the form of democracy? What will be the form of local democracy? What will be the relationship between the center, Kabul, and the regions? Lots of very, very fundamental issues, and this is an opportunity to work through those. And meantime, as I say, as much support as possible to those who are still in Afghanistan, humanitarian support, but also support to civil society groups, to NGOs, to keep alive the flame of civil society, the flame of values which are consistent with international obligations of Afghanistan, respect for human rights, respect for women and girls. So as much support as possible to those groups.
Ambassador, speaking of the values and democratic values, for 20 years, a generation, I'm sure you were in touch with them in Afghanistan, with some of them, of course, that they nurtured the idea of shared democratic values, human rights, women's rights, and free media and all that. But all of a sudden, everything collapsed. When we speak to people on the ground, especially to the younger generation, they feel a little bit let down and disappointed. They feel that the world has a moral responsibility to protect all these values in Afghanistan. So regarding that, what do you think, the big countries that they contributed huge and massively in Afghanistan in blood and treasure can do now to protect those values and not let it die away?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There is inevitably that sense of disappointment and betrayal, and that's understandable in the context of what happened. The unplanned or unwell executed withdrawal. There should never have been a withdrawal of military support for Afghanistan until there was a comprehensive political peace agreement and an inclusive government established. So that was a mistake, and it's quite right that Afghans feel disappointed by that mistake. But that doesn't or shouldn't bring into question the achievements and the achievements and the values that Afghans have developed over the last 20 years. And this is not a Western imposed value system or agenda. I think it is representing a genuine sense in which Afghans have wanted what citizens all around the world generally want, which is freedom to express themselves, freedom to meet, to combine politically, and to have a fundamental say in the choice and election of their leaders and the policy that their leaders follow. Those kind of aspirations, I think, run deep in Afghanistan, and it is, now for Afghans to keep alive that flame themselves, and I have no doubt, that they will be doing that. Now, what international partners and friends can do to support that is certainly to continue access to education, whether that's distance learning or scholarships abroad, or support for education within Afghanistan as well. I think that is key. One of the biggest achievements of the last 20 years, I think, is the bolstering of particularly higher education in Afghanistan, and vast numbers of well-qualified students that have emerged from Afghan universities. All of that, I believe, needs to be supported. And if it can't be supported within Afghanistan, then support it through distance learning or through establishing offshore learning facilities.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, you also pointed out to a very important point, which was that people in Afghanistan should write their own destiny and should decide for themselves, which is very true. But when it comes to Afghanistan, we can't ignore the role and influence of regional countries, for example, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and many others. So with the current scenario, how do you assess, how do you see the role of these countries? Do you think that they're really playing a positive role? Or, there was this also a conspiracy theory that, the West has left Afghanistan, so there is a misery on our shoulders now, and we are, having the burden of it. We are bearing the burden of it. So, how do you assess it, and especially when it comes to Pakistan, how do you see its role in engaging the Taliban and also, helping to reach to a permanent a kind of political solution for the country?
Yeah, I mean, Pakistan, as we can all see, have started to learn the hard way that you can, have a degree of influence over the Taliban, a relationship with the Taliban, but at the end of the day, not the control that you have sought. And the fear of terrorism emanating now and even supported, at least tacitly, by the Taliban is a concern in Pakistan. And it's a concern in the wider region as well. I know China and Russia have spoken also about that as well. So clearly they will remain closely interested in what happens. I think the future for Afghanistan, over the last 10 or 15 years, I think the whole region has cohered around a vision for Afghanistan as being in the economic interests of all the region, that it is stable, that it is a place of good governance, where business can be done, and where a vast expansion in terms of intra-regional trade, whether it's in natural resources, oil and gas, water, electricity, or whatever, that the whole sub-region of Central Asia and West Southern Asia, and also including into the Gulf, can be linked constructively, positively through Afghanistan. But that requires an Afghanistan that is at peace, secure, and stable politically. And I don't believe that the current Taliban are fulfilling that.
But what is the alternative, Ambassador?
The alternative,
Yes.
at the moment, it is the fate of the region not to benefit from a stable Afghanistan, and so there are economic consequences. There's a lack of growth opportunities. Pakistan, for example, they absolutely require access to Central Asia through Pakistan for the transfer of goods and materials, as well as natural resources to flow. Because Pakistan doesn't have a open market with its natural market in India. So at the moment, it has economic consequences negative for Pakistan. It has negative consequences for Central Asia as well. But most of all, it's the Afghan people and Afghanistan that suffers from the lack of opportunity now to capitalize on its geographic location. Its geographic location should be a benefit to Afghanistan as being a central hub, roundabout, or whatever for Central Asia. But unfortunately, it's suffering still consequences of a negative, vicious cycle of factors.
At the moment, Ambassador, we see two oppositions against the Taliban: the military opposition, which is ongoing in some provinces, and also the women on the streets. How do you assess that? Do you think that the solution to Afghanistan's crisis is through military or dialogue, which dialogue is not obviously working?
It's difficult to know. I mean, you are an observer of the political international scene, Tahir, as much as I am, and observing the international scene, I don't see a great indication of active support for armed opposition. It may be that both in the region and wider, they judge that what Afghanistan needs now is a political reconciliation process rather than more civil war and fighting. That said, the armed opposition are an important constituency, if you like. They represent a constituency, and they are clearly demonstrating themselves to be patriotic and nationalistic and brave in many ways. So it's not for me to downplay their importance or to dismiss them. However, I don't see that they are going to gain the international support that would be necessary for them to be really successful on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. Their voice should be heard politically, and it should be and is, part of the makeup of the vast array of Afghan interest groups who are beginning increasingly to try to work together, to try to settle upon a common political agenda, whether it's through their meetings in Vienna or elsewhere. There's several important processes that are underway. There will be many groups and factions that need to have a voice in those discussions. The armed opposition is just one of those.
Mm-hmm. And as a last question, Ambassador, we know that Afghanistan has got a very strong diaspora outside. And so what is your message to them? What do you think they should do? Because at this point that the political, circles, actually, they don't have that much influence, or that is not really working. But I think, we are only left out of the diaspora group that they can at least, work it out, a kind of prescription for the future of the country. So what is your message to them and what they should do to achieve that?
Yeah. No, I think, be of good heart. Be of good spirit. This will be all right in the end, and it will be all right through your hard work and through your efforts, and particularly the efforts now of a younger generation, the generation that has not been sort of former mujahideen, jihadi leaders. Professionally, there are so many Afghans who are involved across the range, whether it's medicine or politics or business or media. I mean, absolutely, higher education, science, technology. Absolutely, keep working at that, and through that, find ways of supporting Afghanistan now. And there are many people who are doing link-ups and scholarships and things like that. Keep working on that. But most of all, focus attentions on working with that former generation of leaders, the older, I won't call them warlords. I know many people do, but, respected leaders of their communities and interest groups who've held leadership positions over the years. The young should work with them, help the older people to pass the baton on to a new generation of Afghans who have a different experience of democracy and a different experience of human rights and civil liberties. Give this new generation a chance to create a political platform eventually, so that when the Taliban fall, and they will fall, that the state of Afghanistan doesn't collapse as well. It's up to the new generation of Afghans, I think, to stitch together now a safety net for their country, to make sure that its institutions, its achievements over the last 20 or so years are sustained.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for a very candid conversation. I really appreciate, and I look forward to meeting you, on other programs as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tahir, and good luck with your ventures.